scientific revolution notes up on the screen. Okay, so sorry for some of you. Anyway, so just because I dealt with that, sorry. But basically, the first part is on the scientific revolution, right? So let's kind of take a look at that and kind of refresh your guys' memory on things that you should be aware of, all right? So we started off talking about the scientific revolution. If you remember, we watched this video. Let me full screen this here. Whoops, wrong full screen here. So we started watching this quick little video about talking about inventions and scientific revolution in general and how it changed the thought process of the people of the time period, right? So basically, if you remember from before the 1500s, people had looked to the past for their knowledge, right? The Renaissance scholars that we talked about earlier in the year and the artists looked to things like ancient Greece and Rome for what they could kind of get from the world, right? The Reformation led to people looking toward the Bible for this truth, right? So starting in the mid-1500s, when we get into what is known as this Age of Reason, you're going to have people kind of really starting to question the world around them, whether it's the physical world and science, or whether it's things like their government and such, and their relationship to these governments, right? That's why we get the Age of Reason, which is the scientific revolution, and the Enlightenment more or less combined, right? So this new way, as we said, of looking at the world is going to result, around the scientific revolution and be called the scientific revolution. And one thing that you should be aware of, right, is this scientific method is it's based around this emphasis on observing nature, right? Systematic observation of nature through experimentation and using your logic and reasoning skills and things like that to come to some sort of conclusion, right? We looked at the scientific method a little bit in class. We had a little warm-up on it, talking about it, right? So this process has been super important for a number of different things and science as we know it today, right? So we're going to get this expansion of knowledge that begins around this time period in the 1500s, right? So we are going to ask you to be familiar with just a number of these scientists. For starters, you have a man named Nicholas Copernicus, right? And Nicholas Copernicus is going to develop the heliocentric theory of the universe, all right? So if you remember, prior to the heliocentric theory and Copernicus, you are going to have this what's called geocentric theory, where you have Earth in the middle right here. You can see my mouse cursor, hopefully, circling the Earth, and the universe circled around the Earth, right? So Copernicus comes up with the idea called the heliocentric theory. And the heliocentric theory is this idea that the sun is actually the center, and these planets, especially us, are revolving actually around the sun. And the thing is that Copernicus wasn't necessarily able to prove that for himself, but what's going to happen is over the course of a number of years, you're going to have more scientists taking a look, right? And you're going to have people like Kepler, and you're going to have people like Galileo, who are going to kind of expand upon this heliocentric model, right? So for starters, you're going to have Kepler, who discovers the idea of the elliptical nature of planetary motion, right? He uses mathematics to do this, and you're going to get this whole thing of this elongated ellipse, elongated oval around the sun and such, right? So this is pretty important. Just for you guys to know, especially tomorrow, I would take a look at the elliptical ocean and remember to associate that with Kepler. But the big part is going to be Galileo, who comes out with the telescope and uses that, and his observations are going to extremely support the heliocentric theory and effectively be able to prove it for Copernicus, right? Copernicus is no longer alive at this point, but Galileo is able to expand on the work of these men to fully support the heliocentric theory with observations and evidence, essentially, right? And basically to come to that conclusion that in fact the Earth revolves around the sun along with the other planets and celestial bodies, right? So we got a little picture here of Galileo using the telescope. We watched a little video about Galileo and the telescope. So next we move to Isaac Newton, right? And Isaac Newton is going to be mostly around the laws of gravity, right? And the laws of motion and planetary motion. You should be familiar with those concepts going into tomorrow. You're going to need to know about Newton for sure. Okay, so we kind of dispelled the myth of the whole idea of the apple hitting his head, right? And the video that we looked at between Neil deGrasse Tyson here and the video from the BBC kind of shares how Newton is going to kind of come to his conclusions based off of the comet that had kind of gone around the sun, and his observations and mathematics that he develops calculus to be able to effectively figure out gravity, right? And then figure out the concept of gravity a little bit. So it's not so much about this apple hitting someone's head. Anyway, our last person that you need to be familiar with is the man. Exactly, Fabian. So anyway, William Harvey is the man that discovers that works with the circulation system, the circulatory system, and the whole idea that blood circulates through the body. I can tell you there will likely be some sort of drawing that looks like this that you're going to need to associate with William Harvey, right? So those are it, right? That's it. We talked about Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Newton, and Harvey. There's really only 5 scientists for the scientific revolution here. So it really isn't that much information that you need to be familiar with as far as people. You should definitely familiarize yourself with kind of the first couple slides of this as well, just the kind of concepts, making expansion of scientific knowledge and such like that. The emphasis on experimentation and reasoning and systematic observation for the scientific method. I would definitely be familiar with that kind of stuff going into tomorrow because it could easily show up. Okay, so I know this is kind of something what we did in class today for a number of you talking about the Enlightenment, but let's take a look at the Enlightenment again too. Yes, Zach, you are going to need to know about the Enlightenment people. We did the jigsaw in class, and we also went over it with notes. So between the two of those, you've gone over these things a number of times now. So you should familiarize yourself with them, and we'll kind of run through them again one more time now to get you guys ready for that. Okay, and so we're not likely going to specifically ask just simple questions like who was Thomas Hobbs, right? We're going to ask you to have to use your brain a little bit to kind of work through maybe a quote or a passage or something like that and associate it with these people. So as long as you know these, you should be able to use your brain to kind of connect the dots a little bit, okay? So the Enlightenment is going on similar time as the scientific revolution, right? The scientific revolution isn't something that happens in just 50 years or something like that. It's a continuous thing for a number of years there, and the Enlightenment is no different. These Enlightenment thinkers are going to continuously build on each other, just like the scientists had a little bit, right? And the Enlightenment is part of the Age of Reason, and it's going to be this intellectual revolution, right? You had this age of faith where people were associating themselves with the Bible, and they were getting their information from the Bible, and you have the Reformation and things, right? But as we talked about, effectively what you have is people kind of stepping a little bit away from religion here, right? It's more of a secular thing versus a religious thing. And that's partially as a result of the craziness that had occurred with things like the 30 Years' War and the wars between Catholics and Protestants after the Reformation. So those things are going to sour people on religion a little bit, and you're going to get people that start questioning religion, you start questioning for the science, and start questioning the governments as well, right? So some of the Enlightenment beliefs come down to the world being run by these natural laws, we're calling it, right? We talked about the scientific method, is being used to kind of now find these natural laws. But what's going to happen is now they start to apply that logic and the reasoning not just to the natural world, but to the political world, their actual world that they experience on a day-to-day basis, right? They start applying the scientific method and scientific knowledge, right? And these applications to matters of government and law, right? And that's what these philosophers start to kind of think about, right? They start to think about their relationship with their governments and with their rulers, and whether or not that's a good thing or not. So I'm going to take this opportunity now to let you guys all know there will be an extra credit question on the test tomorrow. Actually, more like 5 extra credit questions. But the way it's going to work is that if you get all of them, you'll get 2 extra points on your test, right? Your quiz. If you get 3 to 4 of them correct, you will get 1 extra point, and if you don't get 3, well, you're not going to get any of them. You need to at least get 3 to get some sort of point. Okay, and I can tell you that each of these extra credit questions are going to be around what these people actually wrote. So, for example, Thomas Hobbes wrote the Leviathan. John Locke wrote 2 treatises on government. Montesquieu wrote On the Spirit of Laws. Rousseau wrote the Social Contract, and Voltaire wrote Candide. Right. So that's 5 right there. If you're familiar with those and you know them like the back of your hand, that's likely going to be 2 extra bonus points on the test. But that also means we're not going to ask those questions specifically on the test, so you should be aware of that as well. Okay, so let's take a look at each of these people real quick, and we'll get through this, and then we'll let you guys go, unless there's any more questions, to kind of leave you to your studying, right? So Thomas Hobbes wrote the Leviathan, right? And that's something that you need to be aware of for the extra credit. And the big thing about Thomas Hobbes is he is pessimistic about people, right? He is cynical towards people. Would be cynical toward a lot of what these other Enlightenment thinkers are going to be saying, right? Because ultimately what he feels is true is that humans are inherently nasty and inherently evil, that effectively people are going to basically always act in their own selfish interests, right? That people, as a result of others acting in these selfish interests, are in what he calls a state of nature, and in a constant state of war with one another. He goes on to say that life in this state of nature, right, is nasty, brutish, and short, and that people are evil, right? So this is, again, very pessimistic view of people. Yes, Carolyn, that is correct. The extra credit question is going to be all of them. So whichever of the books that they wrote, if you get all 5 right, you'll get 2 points. And then if you get 3 or 4, it'll be 1 point, and then 1 and 2, you'll get nothing. So going back to Hobbes, right, you have humans consenting to government for their self-protection, right? That government exists to protect themselves from other nasty people, right? And that people are going to give up some of these rights to a strong leader or this government in exchange for that protection, right? That self-protection, in exchange for that law and order that they're going to experience. Okay? So that's Hobbes. He's most pessimistic of these guys for sure, right? So next we have John Locke. John Locke writes what's known as 2 treatises on government. And the big thing about Locke and what makes him I'm not really sure who BB09 Adventurer is, but it depends on what day you missed and such, so we'll have to talk to you tomorrow, I suppose, but I would suggest kind of looking things over. It's not a crazy amount of material, so depending on the day that you missed and which period you are, that's going to make a difference. So anyway, back to John Locke, right? He writes this book called 2 Treatises on Government. Ultimately, he feels that kings are not chosen by God, right? And this is an extremely radical stance for the time period, if you remember the time period we're talking about, right? He feels that people are sovereign and effectively consent to their government, right? And they consent to their government for protection of what he dubs natural rights, which are life, liberty, and property. And he basically feels that if government does not protect these rights on behalf of the people, people actually have the right to overthrow the government, to alter or abolish that government, and install a government that's going to be the most effective for their happiness, right? And that is, I can't stress this enough, an incredibly radical idea for the time period, right? And it's really important that you guys familiarize yourself with these concepts, because these concepts you're going to be seeing them again next year in U.S. history. You'll be seeing them again in government, because this right here is more or less the basis for the Declaration of Independence. And Thomas Jefferson, when he writes the Declaration of Independence, draws very heavily from John Locke, right? So, moving on, we have Montesquieu, right? Montesquieu writes what's known as On the Spirit of Laws, and what he goes on to talk about, right, is that he feels that the best form of government is going to include what he calls separation of powers, okay? And this is important for tomorrow. You should really be familiar yourself with that term, separation of powers. So Montesquieu feels that the point of this whole idea of separation of powers is effectively to limit the amount of power that one group or one person can actually have, right? And that's really important, which is why he goes on to say how his thoughts are to have three separate branches, right? This legislative branch, the group that will make laws, executive that kind of runs the government and enforces those laws, and then ultimately the judicial branch that decides on the legality of these laws and the actions of others, right? So he feels that each of these branches should have what are known as checks and balances, right? And checks and balances are the way that these different groups interact with one another, as they interact with one another to basically limit the other group's power, right? So that one group can't get the upper hand. That's the idea anyway. And that's kind of how our government is designed here, right? So Fabian, to answer that question, the whole quiz is multiple choice. It's about 30 questions, all right? So moving on to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who talks and writes about what he calls the social contract. And the social contract is an interesting one, right? It's basically, it is the government, he feels that the government should have a contract, is a contract between the people and the rulers, right? And it's similarly to John Locke. He feels that government is based on the consent of the governed, and that effectively people getting together, right, and as a majority in a community or in a society, their actions and what they decide is right or wrong is what effectively governs the morality of the group, right, as a majority. So he feels that since a group is deciding on the best course of action for the people, based off of what the majority feels like, that some people are going to have to give up rights for the common good. Obviously, we can't all be driving 150 miles an hour on the highway just because you want to, because it would put other people into danger, right? So this is something that a right that we're giving up for the common good. So instead we drive 70, all right, 65 to 80 or whatever the heck I guess the speed limit is going to be where you are, right? So that's kind of this social contract, is this kind of in some cases unwritten, decisions on what is right and wrong in a community that eventually gets codified into actual laws, right? Okay, so our last person is a man named Voltaire, right? And Voltaire writes what's called the Candide, and the big thing that he's going to be dealing with is religion, right? Religious toleration, and religion should triumph over this religious fanaticism, right? But the big thing you're going to get from Voltaire, and you need to kind of be aware of, right, is that government should ensure the separation of church and state, which is another thing that's going to be kind of drawn upon for our, in our government here. The American Constitution, right, enshrines this, and it's going to also be familiar with the Bill of Rights, right? Everyone being able to practice whatever religion they effectively want, right? First Amendment of the Constitution. Congress shall make no law against people's religion, etc., etc. So, anyway, the Enlightenment philosophers that we just talked about, they are extremely influential, in thinking on the political issues of the day, right? So, these philosophers are going to fuel revolutions worldwide, right? And it's going to start in America, who's going to draw heavily on them, and which we've kind of talked about, and we'll do one more quick once over before we're done here. The United States, their success in throwing off England is going to have France Now, looking at them as a model and looking at them as an example for why they want to do it as well, to overthrow the monarchy in France, right? So that's not just that. We have the Haitian Revolution and other revolutions in Latin America and Europe as well that are going to be really, the ball is going to get rolling because of the American Revolution, right? And these Enlightenment thinkers. So lastly here, the following, American documents are incorporated into Enlightenment ideas, right? So we talked about Thomas Jefferson, his Declaration of Independence. We have the Constitution of the United States is going to draw heavily from Montesquieu and the separation of powers and the checks and balances, right? The U.S. Bill of Rights is going to pull from a lot of number of these things, but in particular, Voltaire. You're going to have parts of it, right? Religious tolerance and such. Okay, so these are the important documents that you might get a quote from tomorrow, and you have to kind of line it up with some of the Enlightenment thinkers that you're talking about, right? So be familiar, be ready for that anyway, at least to some extent. Okay. On that note, there's not too much more. If you give me 1 second, there is something else that Mrs. Kipperman went over with you guys that I want to see if I can bring up here. She went over with you. I forget where I can find it, so just give me a minute and then I'll take a look myself. Sorry, I'm still looking for these notes that Mrs. Kipperman also did with you guys. These small little notes that you guys wrote on a separate piece of paper. Okay, I can work with this a little bit, right? Okay, so I know you went over this briefly with Mrs. Kipperman as well, and for period 2, we're going to run through this for about 15 minutes before the quiz, probably. So this will give you a good shot at it again, right? So we talked in our odd periods anyway. Miss Kipperman went over some composers and some writers and some painters that you guys are responsible for being aware of, okay? So you have... the people that you should be familiarize yourself with are Johann Sebastian Bach and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, right, who are classical composers and Baroque composers. I believe Bach is a Baroque. Yeah, Bach is a Baroque composer. I can write that in here, right, for you guys for now. Baroque composer. Okay. And then you have Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who is a classical composer. Voltaire, we already talked about today, right? Sir Miguel de Cervantes is someone who is going to write the first major novel, right? And that is Don Quixote, right? So you should be familiar with that. You're also going to have, such as the novel down here, then you're going to have Eugene Delacroix. Delacroix is going to write, he's going to paint, right, Lady Liberty. He's going to paint Lady Liberty and the Charge of Liberty. I can bring that up to you guys, right? Delacroix, Liberty. So you have Liberty, right, who's leading the people of France to revolution, is Delacroix. So you should be familiarize yourself with that as well. Just at least we went over it already in class for those people I talked about for your odd classes. Even we're going to go over it if you haven't gotten it already in period 8. So anyway, so those are just the quick things you need to be familiar with that I didn't necessarily have in specific notes here. So anyway, that said, I don't think there's anything else that you guys need to be aware of. Any last questions before we shut down for the night? I think this quiz is going to, if you know what you're talking about, it shouldn't be too bad, Fabian. But there are spots that you need to think, right? And I think that's something that you need to be ready for, right? Being able to kind of match up quotes and things like that to people is a little bit more involved than just having to kind of recite that Thomas Hobbs wrote the Leviathan, or Thomas Hobbs, believed in such and such, right? So being able to match things up and use your brain is a little bit more difficult, to be honest. But that's what we're going to be expecting of you guys, being able to draw those linkages. So if you know your material, you should be able to do that. Do we need to know stuff that's not on the quiz? You're going to need to know it maybe for the SOL. For the quiz, you don't necessarily need to know. All right. As far as these people, you should be familiar with the people I just showed you. Okay. On that note, I think we're going to call it a night, unless there's any, again, we'll give you 30 more seconds here for questions. And if not, I'm shutting it down. Alright guys, good night, good luck with your studying, and I'll see you guys either tomorrow or Wednesday. Night.